Hello, folks. Hello, welcome to Wednesday night Techthusiasm Live podcast. We should have an awesome conversation lined up for tonight here. We're going to be talking primarily about the new NZ800 JVC projectors that were just announced. We chatted about them last week, but that was kind of my conjecture, some early opinions and thoughts and reflections, some specs. But tonight we've got two folks joining the chat. I think most of the audience knows. Expert pro calibrators and folks that have had their hands on these units and actually have been had a chance to use them in person, go hands-on, written reviews already in some cases, and certainly a very qualified professional opinions on what they've seen. So hoping the answer to question tonight, what do these guys think of the new JVC projector lineup? What do they think of the state of the projector offerings on the market right now? And take a bunch of questions and all that sort of thing. Hang out for a while, have some fun, and go from there. So without further ado, let me add Kris and Sammie. Welcome, guys. But we'll go around the room. Maybe go ahead, Kris, if you want to start with an intro. You've been on the channel before, but it's been a little bit.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Kris Deering. I own Deep Dive AV. It's a consulting, calibration, and education business, mainly calibrations all around the country. I do education services for dealers that want to educate their employees or do like events for consumers where they want somebody to talk about technologies or anything like that. And then I offer consulting for anybody that's trying to figure out their home theater, just get advice from an expert on different things. So happy to schedule that anytime. But the bulk of the job is pretty much calibration. And as you already know, as most people already know, I used to be a reviewer for Sound and Vision magazine, Home Theater magazine before that, and Secrets of Home Theater and High Fidelity before that even. So I spent almost 2 decades reviewing and testing equipment. So lots of experience to draw from.
Yeah, and Kris was instrumental. It was about middle of last year or so, right? Maybe late last year, right, when we were playing around with the Lumagen. So if anybody's interested about some really deep dive Lumagen kind of content coverage and that, check back to some of our prior live stream and whatnot. Sammie,
Yeah, we did Lumagen
okay.
and Kaleidoscape. We did a couple of
that's right.
on the Kaleidoscape. So hoping that we'll maybe do this again for some new Kaleidoscape stuff at some point.
Yes, don't we all hope?
And not a Terra. Like, oh, there's another one. Should we talk about it?
Yeah, it got more. Bigger. Yeah, we're all waiting with bated breath for those new Stratos for sure.
Yeah. So my name's Sammie Prescott. I am also a professional calibrator, about 15 years of experience. Primarily started focusing with, direct view, flat panels, direct view displays. And then I kind of transitioned more into doing projection, which led me to being a reviewer with Projector Central. So I've been reviewing with them now for a little over 2 years, actually almost 3 years now. And I also do consulting as well. So sometimes I work with different manufacturers. They'll send product where it's either pre-release, super early, or just released, and they might have various issues with like their color mapping or just this core functionality for how it should work or how it should look. So I work with manufacturers on that, and I also do some work with Matt VR for the Envy as well.
Yeah, definitely appreciate your help getting the Envy that's sitting in the Techthusiasm home theater right now. Yep. It's been a fun little ride playing around with that lately. All right, so for folks that might not know, it was about a week ago, right? Maybe just a couple of days more than that. We had the drop JVC. Let me put this up here. Actually, JVC NZ800 and JVC NZ900 announced availability expected to be next month, I think. Essentially replacing the two existing models, direct mapping NZ8 to the NZ800, NZ9 to the NZ900. Same MSRPs, right around, I think it's what, 15,000, 26,000. New features, new capabilities, brighter. Actually, when you guys kind of, let's do kind of a first take, hot take. What, Kris, maybe, what excites you about the new unit? What do you think stands out to you as some of the worthy upgrades that they've put in there?
I mean, from a marketing standpoint, just looking at, this sheet you have up here, Gen 3 panels, anytime anybody says they're doing a new iteration of a imaging chip, it's always something that always perks me up, because that means that they probably went back to trying to figure out something that was a complaint from people in the past. um, JVC, yeah, as it says here, this is the Gen 3 chip, first generation 0.69. This is actually their fourth 4K chip, but it's the third generation of the 0.69, because they did have a larger one for their commercial side projectors before. So the Gen 1 being the 4500, the Gen 2 being the NX series, and then the previous NZ series. Um, if you look back at the 1080p days, I think they got to a Gen 8 or a Gen 9 chip with the 445, 46, 40 series. And sometimes it would be pixel density, or like pixel size, so what the gaps were. Sometimes it was contrast. It was a bunch of different things, but they went through quite a few generations of that chip. And nowadays we're in this thing where most companies really aren't updating their projectors. In a lot of cases, from the brands that kind of compete in this space, you typically see things that look more firmware related than, I would say, hardware related. We're seeing less and less of what I would say is like hardware R&D. So I'm just glad to see, that there is hardware development still going going on in this. That obviously I hope means that JVC, in particular, or any brand, when they do this kind of thing, means that they're succeeding enough that they want to continue to put money into R&D, which is what you want to see. We don't want to see it just start to fall off. In this case, when I talked to the engineers at JVC, they basically said this new chip, the biggest thing that they were trying to address was the flatness of the chip. One of the common complaints that you see in AV enthusiast boards and things like that is the black field uniformity. As you get lower and lower in contrast, higher in contrast, lower in black floor, it's obviously easier and easier to see any kind of uniformity issue. It's just a fact. Look at OLED. I mean, they're still trying to combat uniformity near black, or just straight black field uniformity. Our eyes become more and more contrast sensitive when you're looking at something that dark. So the point of this was to try to do that, which again was one of the main things that you kind of see as a common complaint. So that was nice to see that they're actually taking that feedback and trying to do something about it. Obviously, I've only looked at one of these units. I looked at an NZ900. So I only have one sample to draw from. It was an improvement in black field uniformity compared to a lot that I have seen. But with a sample of one, there's no way I could say that, yep, they've solved it. This new generation is going to be great, because I've seen in the previous generation units that had no issues at all with uniformity, and then others that were really bad, and kind of everything in between. So it was always a little bit of a lottery, which I think is what people didn't like. They're obviously claiming a higher native contrast. Like any company, JVC I think plays the marketing thing a little bit on that. One, every time they claim a native contrast, it's in the mode that really is unusable. 150,000 to 1 would mean that you're the highest output, you're at the longest throw, and you're closing your aperture down to the lowest point to get that black floor down more and more and more. And it usually ends up with a light output that's just not really usable. When I used to do
Yeah.
reviews, I would always see if they could meet that spec, but I would usually try to report what the actual native contrast of the light engine, with that chip is, in what I think is more reasonable setups and stuff like that. They did claim 150,000 to 1 with the 25 LTD, which was just a hand-picked NZ9. All the parts were hand-picked, and I didn't really measure. Well, I never tried to do full contrast measurements of that design, but it didn't really seem that much different than the NZ9. my measurements of this one, and I know Sammie's going to comment on this as well because he's done these measurements. I did see an improvement over the last time I reviewed an NZ series. When I reviewed the NZ9 for sound and vision, I did see an increase over that. Again, sample of one, but it does look like they made improvements in there.
They did, but it's mainly because they increased the brightness, right? It is 10% brighter, but the black floor is still the same. Like the black floor is
on
still
yours,
going
you
to
were
measure.
seeing the same black floor down, as you're seeing natively from the other ones. I thought
Yeah,
on
it's
mine I
going to.
measured it a little bit lower, but we're also talking about like usually when you're measuring black floor, even with that much of an increase, it's like one one
Yeah,
significant to two significant digits. So it
well, yeah,
doesn't,
and that's what it is. I measured like 0.004, right?
yeah. And
So
that's what I
black did drop a
feel is
little
the
bit,
average for JVCs.
but that's pretty normal, right? So
Yeah.
by them increasing by 10%, getting to 3,300 lumens, but only in high bright, that's how they got the contrast. If you look at it normally, like natural, it's like 125,000, 129,000 to one.
Yeah,
Like that's what it really is.
I have my measurement here. I did it in natural. I think you had done it in high bright. When I did it in natural, the max contrast on mine was 116,000 to 1. Now, I don't remember because it's just been so long since I did the NZ9 for sound and vision. So I don't remember on that one if I did high bright mode or if I did like natural to give it, like, to me, a more realistic, even max spec. But this one, again, when you're talking contrast, when people talk about contrast, I mean, yes, the ratio matters because it tells you where it's going to be depending on what light point you're at. But I think most people think of contrast as how good are the blacks. Like most people, when they're talking about contrast, especially sequential, they're thinking about it as blacks, blacks, blacks. But you can have a high sequential contrast with it not really that good of a black level because you're getting it so much in white, as Sammie knows. I see this quite a bit with like the GTZ 380. Not to say that it doesn't have good contrast, but its black floor is limited to a number where you can have you'll think that it's lower than it is, but it actually has a floor that it's not going to go below. On the JVCs natively, I tend to find that the native black floor, without using an aperture or anything, typically just hovers right at about 0.004. It's incredible how many you measure. It's like 0.004, 0.004, 0.004. I see some that get down into 0.03. I see some that are 0.05. I've rarely seen one that's 0.06. But I'd say 0.04 is right in there. But again, as you measure these, when you're talking about that kind of, you're 3 digits in, it's hard to measure, and be consistent because again, all it takes is 1 digit shift and you are moving your contrast significantly.
Yes.
So, but I'm with Sammie. Most of the time I see about a 0.4. I did measure again a little bit higher on this one. I don't remember what the black floor is. I have my ratios, but I didn't write down in my little notes thing like what the this and that was. So
I would have to pull up my reports because I have them all saved in my reports. I just don't have them open right now.
yeah, I was just writing them down as I was doing it because I had just a T10 in front of the lens and I was just sitting there doing the math on my phone while I was knocking them out. So I just saved the ratios. But so for this one, again, 150,000 a native contrast. Again, it's the same thing they've done. It's the same thing everybody does. It's more of a marketing thing. I saw in mine, again, using natural, but not calibrated, but natural mode is it's not bad for a calibration out of the box. From short throw to long throw, because you are going to get a different contrast ratio if you're at the shorter end of the throw versus the longer end of the throw because of the way the light engine works. On my sample, I was 22,000, about 23,000 to 1, 23,000 to 1 on the short throw and 33,000 to 1 on the long throw. So that you pretty much people can expect if this sample is in line with what they would get to be at worst case scenario contrast in that range from the projector itself, which is still more than double what any of their competitors
You're going to get from
are, if
anyone
not
else.
more. Yeah. I mean, JVC's chief competitor at these price points is the Sony's. Sony's make a good projector, again, a higher contrast than LCD or DLP, but the last generation with their new 16:9 chips took a hit in contrast compared to what they were before. So they were kind of clocking in before at about 16,000 to 1, a little bit lower after calibration. So maybe low teens, 12,000, 13,000 to 1. Full black. They also have that problem where if you have like even so much as a pixel on the screen, they drop their black more, where the JVCs don't do that. The GTZ 380 doesn't do that either, but the other ones do. But on the new range, I'm seeing anywhere between like 5,000 to 8,000 to 1. So now you're at like a third of the contrast of these. Again, still better than DLP, which tends to fall in a little bit of a range as well. Sammie would probably have more to say on that because I think he works on more DLPs than I do. But
yeah, I work on a lot of DLPs.
Yeah,
but
so
I mean,
still a significantly better contrast than anything else out there,
by
really,
far.
other than a $500,000 projector, but not a huge jump in contrast compared to the previous NZ series. Not something, I mean, definitely not enough that I think you would notice it unless you were doing a side-by-side test, and even there, I doubt it, that there would be enough noticeable difference there. The nice thing about increasing contrast, in even if it's small, though, is that it means that these are probably more likely to meet a contrast spec than the other generation, because you're starting from a slightly better chip for it. So you have a better, if you thought of this as like a mid-cycle refresh, like cars do, this is kind of what I think of this line, despite the fact that they've changed stuff. I just think the small polishing that they did would make it where you're more likely to get a better NZ9 sample than you were getting before. I kind of felt the same way about the 25 LTD. They advertise a lot, handpick this, handpick that. It's a great projector. All of the ones that I measured, and I measured all of them because I was the one that calibrated every single one of them in the United States. They all measured on the high side of what I usually see from an NZ9. So I'm hoping, again, as these get out there and I'm measuring them and Sammie's measuring them and other calibrators that I talk to, that's the trend, where you're just seeing like the higher end of the spec, or a little bit more consistent, in those terms. So
what stands out to you, Sammie, in terms of your hands-on time?
So, I mean, Kris has seen infinitely more JVCs than I have. I do a lot of JVCs, but he's seen many, many, many more. But the thing that stood out the most to me was it is sharper. It was noticeably sharper, almost to a fault. It was almost too sharp, to the point where, like, if you're the type of person to use any of the like high res enhance, and you would use it at its default value, or say even a value of 3, you're probably going to have to turn that down because it's very, very sharp. That was noticeable. What else stood out was, I would agree with Kris. Like, if you had these side by side, like a NZ9 and a 900, and you were looking at both of them, same picture, both calibrated, set up properly, outside of visibly seeing the difference in the sharpness, you're not going to probably see too much of a difference in terms of brightness or luminance, unless you just did not level like lumen match them. Like, if they were not set up exactly the same, you let one run a little bit more wild than the other, you might notice a little bit of more brightness. But I would be pretty confident in saying that outside of just visibly noticing the sharpness, there's not anything else that like stood out right away until I started using it a little bit longer. It is quieter. It is much quieter, which is good, because now you can run it at a higher laser level if you wanted to, and it will still be quieter than an NZ8, NZ9, any of those. Again, though, this is sample size of 1, right? Like, I had one, Kris had one. We've talked, and we did see some similarities, like some of the brightness uniformity, or how the fan worked, how it would like spin up and it would like kind of normalize, and then it would spin down a little bit, and then it was just very quiet. So that's reassuring, right? That at least out of these two samples, they function so closely. But um, outside of that, nothing else really stood out to me. It's the exact same chassis. It looks really no different. Um, it's not unfamiliar. As soon as you go into it, you know exactly where everything is at. You know exactly what everything does. Um, so I would say the sharpness and the audible noise level is what stood out the most to me.
Yeah, when I was doing my testing, I didn't get to really compare direct sharpness. Obviously, I have an NZ9 in my system, but mine's, mounted on a ceiling with an anamorphic lens. And for the little bit of time that I had, I didn't want to unmount it, undo my lens and everything just to do that direct comparison. I will. It's like I had been talking to before the video started. I will have a chance to look at another one of these next week, and in that case, I will actually have a chance to stack it with an NZ9. So I'm hoping to do a little bit more direct comparison to look at the sharpness differences. When I first started talking to JVC about this before I got it, one of the things that he said was that the new video processing in there, he was seeing, at least in the factory testing that he did, a very noticeable difference in sharpness when you had the two side by side. Um, Again, as I say, and every time I do like shootouts and everything, it's a lot easier to see something when you're comparing it directly to something else. Our eyes are amazing at that comparison
Yeah.
because we're
Right.
seeing something in real time. But I always try to be careful with that, because if I do a side by side with like another NZ9, I'm like, oh yeah, they're different. But you also have to try to balance that with like, okay, well, what if it was in the next room? If one was in one room and
Exactly.
one was in the other, and I walked over to that room, would I be able to tell that difference? Because it's easy to spot stuff when you can directly compare it, but nobody's watching these projectors like that. They are technically watching in a vacuum. Nobody's sitting there like, I'm watching, Superman tonight, and I'm going to have 4 projectors running at the same time so I can bounce between them.
Right.
So you always got to be a little careful with that. But I do want to look at that just so I can say that, like, oh yeah, I am seeing a change. The nice thing, and I confirmed it today, is that the sample that I'll be seeing next week is not the sample that Sammie already saw, which he and I have talked about, and it's not the one that I worked on. So it's another sample to
Oh,
see, does
okay.
it kind of do those things. And Sammie, I don't know what his schedule is, but I'm going to be in Colorado looking at this, so I'm hoping he'll be able to participate as well.
Yeah.
Um, One other thing I did see
Sure.
that did make a difference, though, Sammie, and I know you did too, but you didn't mention it, is I did like the new laser dimming.
Yes. Yeah. The laser dimming balanced is really good.
Yeah,
Like it is. It's
quite a bit.
really good.
It's good enough that I would want to use it, at least in the testing that I did. I would probably use it all the time, where I do not use their laser dimming at the moment.
That's an auto mode, right? Or
No.
The
So you
laser
have.
mode has 3, like low, high, and balanced, and the one we're talking about is balanced. Right now, it's mode 1, 2, 3 in the
In the
dimming
current
dynamic. I
models,
don't remember what they call it in the menu, but it is their laser dimming for contrast.
it's
So
dynamic control.
dynamic control, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That is actually really good, to the point where I would use it all the time.
Yeah.
I would
At
pretty
least
much
from
use
what
it
I
all the
saw
time.
so far. Obviously, with more time and a little more scrutiny, maybe not. But the current ones, mode 1, 2, and 3, mode 1 and 2, I find to be a little too aggressive, where they try to make the blacks look really good at the expense of other parts of the image. Where yes, blacks look better, but then the image looks flatter to me because it almost eliminates any highlights at all. So you don't get that sense of both. Mode 3 doesn't do anything to black when there's any kind of highlights on the screen. So depending on how much black area you have versus the highlights, your blacks might not look as good. But in more mixed scenes, I think it looks better. But then it tends to modulate the gamma and the brightness levels a bit too much when you have the rare scene that's really, really dark with no highlights. So like something at dusk when somebody's walking and there's no highlights at all. A good scene for that is the beach walk scene in the House of the
Game of
Dragon or whatever,
Thrones.
the Game
Yeah.
of Thrones that everybody complained about when the two people are walking that beach where it's just everything is dark. There are no highlights. It's a stress test for any display, but that struggled. But the balanced ones seem to do a really good job of actually making the blacks look darker in mixed scenes while still affecting a little bit of the highlights, but not nearly as much that it's distracting.
Yeah, it maintained them fairly well. Because if you try to use mode, at least for me, if I try to use mode 3, you could actually see the highlight dim. Like you could see it like kind of just like kind of
Yeah.
start to clamp down. And it's annoying. It's something that you can, once you see it, you can you can start to see it without looking for it. This didn't happen on Balance. Like Balance was actually really good.
Yeah. This has the same tone mapping as the last version because they just did the firmware update not that long ago to the Gen 2 frame adapt, which I wrote a thing about, or I don't remember. I think you and I might have even talked about it, where I said that it does do a little bit better job with their tone mapping, especially in the auto wide mode, which a lot of people like because it makes it brighter because it's
Yeah.
more compressed. It's still not perfect. It still has, issues, but it's still by far the best onboard tone mapping I've seen in a projector
Yes.
against any other brand. The new
Yeah.
one uses the HDR has metadata associated with it. Before they were looking at the max CLL, which just defines the max pixel value that's seen in a movie. But the problem with that is that it doesn't tell you which pixel that is or if it's just one pixel in the entire movie. Now it uses the display max, which has to do with the display that was used when they mastered the movie. It will tell you what that display was capable of. It's not always
It could,
right. It doesn't really
yeah,
mean that that
it could
things are going to
potentially
get
help.
better. It is another piece of information, and more often than not, it's right. But
Well, you could have a scenario where you could be missing the actual metadata of
correct.
what it actually is. So like then it can fall back onto this as long as that's available. So you have the potential to have better tone mapping, but I mean, in all honesty, like if they really want to, and this is not like by far JVC has the best tone mapping from any projector manufacturer,
Yeah.
period. But if someone, whether it be JVC or anyone, really wanted to do it right, you would need to know your max measure peak white and black. If they allowed you to put that in, it would be like fantastic. Like that would be awesome if they allowed you to do that, but they don't. So
Yeah, that's actually something I've talked and I've sent several letters to JVC about. Actually, when they first introduced the theater optimizer, um, I sent them an email saying, hey, I'm a pro calibrator. I set these up all the time, um, and it would really be nice, if you had the whole point of the theater optimizer in the JVC tone mapping is so that JVC's whatever algorithm they're using for their HDR has like a way to make a best guess on what the brightness is off your screen, because you're telling it, hey, I have this big of a screen with this gain, and it already knows what the zoom is because it's a motorized zoom, so they know where they're at on that. They know if you're in low lamp, they know you're in high lamp, they know if you have a color filter in, they know the things that you're doing that would affect the lumen output of the projector. So based on that, they're making some kind of guess. When in reality, if you had like even in like a code, like a service mode or something, where if I'm a calibrator and I'm on a site, they don't have to guess. I can just tell them what the peak white is measured off the screen. So they would know exactly what they have or what their black floor is. I mean, if you look at any Dolby Vision calibration for, when you're replacing their master file that they use that's generic for that lineup, they literally do a series where they measure peak white, black, and then they measure where each of the color 100% saturation points are for each color. So they have literally profiled that display in like a minute, and they know exactly what it can do so that they can tone map or do whatever that they're going to do to that. I don't see any reason at all why they can't do that. I mean, heck, JVC even has their auto calibration software that could do something like that. Now, I don't know if that would go over as well because I don't really agree with the meters that they use by default, and it
Right.
could get into that territory where, depending on how the measurement was taken and things like that, it could be worse, or anything. But if you had it for a pro calibrator, like tie it to their ISF modes or something like that, I think they could get a better result from that.
Yeah,
Um,
because it reports the levels when you do the auto cal. It's just
it
that
does. Yeah.
it just depends on, like you said, how you do it. Because if you have someone that's reading it off the lens,
Oh, yeah, I
then
know.
yeah. So
Yeah, I've seen plenty of people where I get there and they're like, "Oh, I ran the auto cal," and it was, I've seen some where it's pretty good, and I've seen some where it's really bad. So, that can vary. But it is the same tone mapping. They just added the display max. I don't really see how that's going to help that much. I can't really think of very many scenarios that it would, unless the max CLL exceeds the display max and the information is correct. You could use the display max instead of the max CLL, because I'm not aware of any HDR mastering monitors that that clip no that tone map. So they should only be going, unless they wanted it to look clipped, it should only be going to the display max. Um, and then the other one is they have the new black mode in there that kind of makes it come out of black a little bit slower, so that the bottom end, kind of the mid to lower end range, doesn't look as elevated. So if you have a room where you like to preserve more of a contrasty look, turning that on makes that look a little bit. And I think Sammie noticed that as well.
yeah, I mean, what it does is if you have something that's supposed to measure a specific value. So this is all for HDR. One, this only works in Frame Adapt, and it only works in Filmmaker, which can use Frame Adapt as well. So it only works with HDR, and you really don't need it for gamma anyways, for like just SDR. But what it does is HDR is an absolute value. Like it's absolute. Like it's logarithmic. It's saying like, oh, if this point is supposed to be this bright, it is specifically this code value, this many nits, like exact. So when you're measuring S or HDR, you could have something that's supposed to be, I don't know, zero point 0.7 in terms of nits, or it might need to be 1.2, right? Whatever. That might be the target for it being accurate. If you have deep black turned off and then you measure that point might measure, 1.9, or it might measure 2.1. When you turn it on, it basically just pulls it back down to be accurate, to track the EOTF um, accurately up to about 15%. And after that, it just tracks how it's going to track. Um, it works. It actually does what it's supposed to do. And it doesn't crush anything because it's bringing it down to where the EOTF is supposed to be. My only problem with it is that, and this is probably just because I'm a calibrator and I'm always thinking accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. If it was just accurate to begin with, you wouldn't need it. Like that wouldn't be like a needed feature. But having it as being able to turn on or off, that's good, because some people may not want that. They might want to elevate it. So it's good that they have it. I'd rather have it than not. But it does work. It does exactly what it's supposed to do. And it looks good too. So
fair to say that they're moving forward on the quality of the built-in tone mapping, but I presume both you guys might still prefer, if cost no object in the system and whatnot, that using Lumagen or a MadVR still for tone mapping would be a preference for most folks, a performance preference if you can.
yeah.
I wouldn't say for most folks. I think Sammie and I would both be in agreement that MadVR and Lumagen options offer better tone mapping than the JVC, but I I also, try to put a realistic view that most people aren't nearly as critical of video as we are. I typically tell people that reach out to me about, like, say Lumagen, or even if they were reaching out saying, "Hey, I'm thinking about buying, a Mad VR," or they're just saying, "I want an external tone map solution because I'm buying a new projector. I'm buying a new NZ9. I want to go all out. Maybe I should add this in there." Um, I generally tell people, again, it's really easy to get caught up in the, oh, there's something else, there's something more, there's something more. You know, you see it in everything. You know, you're looking at cars, you're looking at this or whatever. There's always the guys that are like, oh, but it has this thing and you gotta have that thing. I'm generally of the position, JVC's tone mapping is pretty good. Is it perfect? No, but you know, there really isn't any that are perfect because there isn't an actual, you know, standard that tells you it's perfect. Uh, I would say from a tone, if you're buying one of these and you're thinking about an external processor because of tone mapping specifically, I mean, there's other things that video processors add that, you know,
Right.
make it a different conversation. But if we're talking about tone mapping, I would say buy a projector, you know, whatever one you're going to get. I don't care if it's a Sony, an Epson, JVC, anything, and spend some time with it watching HDR. You know, go through, you know, watch content you might be familiar with. Just spend a week, you know, even a week. It's really not that long, you know, a week or two. And if you start noticing issues when you're playing HDR that are bothering you, but you don't see issues when you're watching SDR content, um, then that would be the time to reach out to somebody that, you know, sells or is familiar with those products that can tell you if the things that are bothering you are actually something that can be solved by a video processor. Because
Right.
there's some things that people think video processors fix, like, oh, I really like this, but you know, the blacks never look good. But I heard that if I buy this video processor, my blacks are going to be better. Or, you know, I wish the color had more color, and I heard that if I buy a video processor, it's going to give me that. And that's not always the case. Again, you know, marketing can get away, or just people have this thing that they think that something is going to do something, and then it perpetuates in the echo chambers of AV forums and things like that. So with anything like this, again, it's easy to get sucked into the hype of stuff. I always tell people, like, if you have one of these, spend some time with it. And if you feel like something is bothering you, something's taking you out, you're noticing something, then, you know, get hold of me or whoever you're working with and say, these are the things that are bothering me. And hopefully, you know, they'll be honest enough to tell you that, like, yeah, and that a video processor would fix. Because a video processor, you know, regardless of which one you're looking at, they're a pretty hefty investment,
Yes.
and stuff like that. So if I have somebody that I know is not super critical and isn't, I don't think, going to get bothered by the edge cases that JVC tone mapping is going to have a problem with, and they're looking at a projector, and, like, let's say they're looking at an NZ7 and they're like, oh, I'm thinking about an NZ7 and, you know, a video processor. Again, doesn't matter which one. And I'm like, I know this guy. There's no way that he's gonna, like, the little edge cases that people, you know, sit there and talk about, and it makes it sound like there's a lot of problems when there really isn't. You know, if he's like, well, but I have the budget for that, that's a lot more budget. That could put him into an NZ8 or even possibly an NZ9, where you would probably see a more significant difference in picture, you know, attributes or whatever by going to the next step up, especially with these,
Yeah.
because there are significant jumps in how bright they are and things like that. You know, contrast stuff and everything else like that might be the better investment. Where there's other cases where I look at what their system is and I'm like, oh yeah, I think you would benefit greatly from a video processor, because there's more than just the tone mapping. It's like aspect
Right,
ratio,
right.
stuff
Aspect
like
ratio control,
So-
subtitle handling.
Yeah.
so, yeah.
And the guy that bought, so I just sold my NZ8. And the guy, I recalibrated it to his screen material and his throw, et cetera, sent it out to him. Everything's fine. And I talked to him on the phone just to help him, like, you know, dial in a few different things. And he asked me about a video processor. It's like, well, from what you were coming from to what you're going to now, just see how you like this first, because what problem is it that you're actually trying to solve? Like in his case, it's like, okay, it will solve your aspect ratio control 100%. But do you need it? Like, are you pretty much only watching movies? Are you only watching things on Netflix that are like 2.0? Just make a lens memory. Not to say that he's not going to benefit from a video processor, because most people would benefit from one, but most people don't need one. Like, no one needs an NZ900. No one needs a video processor. Half the stuff that we have, we don't actually need. Is it nice to have? Yes. Does it make life easier and this is a huge convenience, absolutely. But no one absolutely needs one. Like if you have an NZ7, NZ8, NZ9, and you're happy with it, or if you get a 900, 800, and you're happy with it, you don't need to go run out and get a video processor unless you're trying to fix something specific. That's really what you should be looking at. Like, what am I trying to solve by getting this? Because if you're getting it just for, see, but also in this hobby, people will buy something for just one thing. But like, if you're really just trying to fix it for one thing, maybe really sit down and think of like, what projector am I getting? What do I want? Because then I can maybe use the extra or the money that I'm going to save getting a 900 by getting an 800 instead, and then getting a video processor. So there's a lot of thought that should be put into it.
Yeah, for folks wondering about that, that's the kind of content that I've been trying to focus specifically in this last stint with the Mad VR is bit by bit, just showcasing elements of what it does in the system, and not necessarily to push that, oh, like you got to have this, you got to have that, but these are the various things that it can do. This is how it works. This is how you set it up. This is how it integrates, and this is kind of the result. So check those out. So we got a super chat. I knew that this would be a question of the day. So maybe answer this as you guys see fit. Maybe what do you see as some of the?
Hey, Sammie, I don't think we've ever talked about this ever, have we?
Yeah, no, never. It's never been a conversation.
Never come up, even between you and I don't think we've ever actually hashed this out.
Yeah.
So I'll say the same thing that I say every single time, and again, like I'll just put it out there. Sammie already said, he does some work with Mad VR. He does a lot of stuff behind the scenes with them. I am an actual Lumagen dealer. I'm not a Mad VR dealer, but I am a Lumagen dealer. I own a Lumagen and use it in my system. I owned it before I was a Lumagen dealer. I generally tell people that both products are fantastic. They both have their little things that one can do that the other can't do. And they're mostly come down to like one or two little things, so whether or not you need that thing or that thing could kind of almost tell you which one you're going to end up getting. But in terms of just performance, if we're talking kind of like what we were just talking about before, I think that let's do a hypothetical. Sammie obviously is very familiar with Mad VR because he does a bunch of work with them. He has a Mad VR there. If we had two NZ900s and Sammie took his Mad VR and he set it up and he put it like where it's like it's in room A, and we had a splitter playing the same content, and then I set up a Lumagen in the other room, I would bet that even if you just let it sit there for forever and run, that 99% of people would not be able to tell the difference. When it comes to just video performance, they both are excellent products. They both do a good job with the majority of things that they do. The difference is you start getting into that, like where you're really trying to pick apart something with like edge cases that will happen once in a bajillion, frames or whatever. That, like, yes, there are differences, but I think that they're just things that, again, most people using this would never even, unless you point it out, and even then they might not notice it. Again, unless you're talking about specific features. So again, Mad VR has some features that Lumagen doesn't have. Lumagen has some things that you can do that Mad VR can't. And obviously there's a pretty decent price disparity between the two that has to be taken into account. But I generally say, like, if you have bought a Mad VR or thinking about a Mad VR, it's not like you're going to buy it and be like, oh man, this thing, looks like crap or whatever, and vice versa. Same thing with Lumagen. Again, if these products are set up properly by people that know what they're doing, I just think that most of the time, most people aren't going to notice anything. Again, unless they need something very specific that one has that the other doesn't. That's my opinion.
Yeah, so I've owned both. I had a Lumagen 4444 prior to getting a Mad VR, and I have a Mad VR now. I have an MV Extreme, a Mark II. So if I will honestly say, because I've owned both and I've used both, and then I still calibrate both, right? So like even with Kris, right? Kris is a calibrator. I'm a calibrator. I will go to someone's house on a job, and I will calibrate a Lumagen. Like it's to me, it doesn't matter, right? They're both are going to do what they're supposed to do. Um, I would say if someone there are not a significant amount of differences. There are differences between the two. Mainly, some have some features. Some like the Envy has like Motion AI. The Lumagen has a switcher effectively. The Lumagen is 1 RU. The Matt VR is 4 RU. Like outside of like those big differences, when it comes to what they do, they both do the same thing. It's just slightly different as to how they do it. So a good example, Lumagen, you do vertical stretch. Lumagen will do vertical stretch, but it won't do vertical NLS,
It will not do
right?
vertical NLS. Yeah.
Right. So there's like that difference. You could do like motion interpolation with the Envy. So this is where it becomes kind of very specific to the person. So like myself, even with Motion AI, I personally don't use it because I don't use motion interpolation at all on anything that I own.
But there's a
But
lot of people that want that feature, though.
yeah, they want that feature
Yeah.
and they will get an Envy to get it. Myself personally, now that I've had both, I know how to configure both. I know how to set up both. I know how to calibrate both. If I were to choose for my own personal use because of my theater, not totally just thinking of my theater, like Kris knows I have a motorized screen, I would choose an Envy because of geometry correction, 100%. Like that's what I would choose for myself. Um, there's other little differences here and there, but I would say outside of once you start getting into very specific features, they ultimately are going to do the same thing for you. It's just how they do it is different. One might be a little better here in this area, one might be a little better here in that area. But if you get either product, you're not getting a bad product.
Yeah, I usually
One
tell
thing,
people, Envy, like you said, geometry correction with the image warping. So if they're having some issue with like an anamorphic lens where they're seeing a lot of geometry distortion that's actually bothering them, they can fix that with that.
right,
You're in the case where your screen is a tab tension screen, so it's always going to have that little bit of distortion, so you can try and fix that.
right.
And then Motion AI. The big thing with Motion AI, I have used it a little bit on the Envy. I have a few clients that have used it. I've had few clients that have tested it against the motion interpolation in their display, and then found that like they don't really notice that much difference. And then there's other people that I've seen that are like, oh, I love it. It's so much better than what their display is. So that'd be something that if you're thinking about that, but you have a display that already has frame interpolation, you might want to at least maybe have an opportunity to compare the two to see how much, because I've seen some people think that if they use it, like there is no soap opera effect, but I don't really think that that's possible. But it might be less than what the display they has, because even if you went from an Epson, Sony, and a JVC and compared their frame interpolation to each other, you're going to see differences. So it would
Yeah,
be a matter of, does this one bother me less than the other, but still give me what I want? The big one with Lumagen, when somebody says, is anybody that's into gaming, if you want to do gaming with a video processor in line, you're going to have to use a Lumagen. You're not going to be able to use a Mad VR. And for some people,
yeah,
that's something that they really want. They want to be able to game while still using a video processor for aspect or for tone mapping or something like that. And then the other thing that's nice about the Lumagen is, as Sammie said, it can be used as a switcher for multiple sources, where the Envy is a single in and single out. I don't really see that. It used to be more of a deal because there used to be a lot of like AVRs and surround processors that had issues with like actually getting a true pass through for video, or them not messing with the video where you wanted to go through a Lumagen, so you don't have that. Um, More often than not, if I have a client that needs to use it as a switcher, it generally is because they have devices that don't really work with newer devices. So it might be an older HDMI thing where the Lumagen can work around that, or something like that, where you need something specific for a device to make it work in a system that it wouldn't work if you had to plug it into like a new AVR or something like that. So
yeah,
those are the things, like like Sam was saying, that I see the same thing where I'm talking to somebody, if they're like, hey, I really need something to correct the barrel distortion from an anamorphic lens. I'm like, well, you're gonna have to get an Envy. Or if like I'm really big, I want to run my Xbox through this or whatever, I'd be like, well, you're most likely going to have to use a Lumagen. So
Yeah, and like with the gaming thing, like if you want to game with a process, well, with it actually processing, you do have to use Lumagen, because you can run a gaming system through like your AVR and then use a pass through, but that's completely unprocessed. So if
Yeah.
you want
yeah,
tone mapping, aspect ratio control, all that stuff, you would have to use like a Lumagen.
yeah.
Then
I would,
like you have a bunch of different little things. It's like we could go through it like all night, but really, like, okay, if you want 8K, you would get a Matt VR, something like that. But honestly, no one should be buying any of this stuff sight unseen. Like at the price points they are, um, you should be going somewhere to see them.
yeah.
And these are not something that are, um, you get it sent to you and you just set it up. They're supposed to be set up by like installers. No matter how easy or difficult someone thinks something is, they're custom install products, and that's how they're supposed to be set up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
From my
for sure.
experience so far, I would say the motion AI is really interesting. And I've demoed it quite a bit myself, and I've demoed it to other folks, and I think it can do some really cool things, but I need more time because I really want to get it connected to something like these new projectors, to an HDMI 2.1 120 hertz connection, because I don't think I think that will work a lot better to be frame cadence matched essentially. The other thing I'll say,
Have you found that, Sammie? I thought I read that Matthias likes it better at 60p than 120p.
I've tried it. I've ran Motion AI at 48 hertz on Barco's. I ran it at 120 hertz on JVC's. I ran it at 60 hertz. My personal preference is I prefer it at 60 if I use it. Some
interesting.
people, they want it as smooth as could possibly be, and they'll run it at 120.
Yeah, I could have sworn that Matthias had put something out saying that he actually thinks it works better at 60p, but that's hearsay. I didn't see the thing. I've just seen that several times from people saying that he recommends running it at 60, not at 120.
Okay.
I would probably run it at, I'm trying to think what you would lose on, depending on the display, which you could potentially lose by running it at 120.
Well, there's only the JVCs, and I'm not aware of
Yeah,
them turning anything off for that. Although
Hmm.
you have
you
to be
could,
in,
absolutely.
that's not true. I guess you have to be in low latency mode to run 120, don't you? So you lose laser
Oh,
dimming,
do you?
and
Oh,
you
that's not a
lose theater optimizer, which doesn't matter if you have a
yeah.
No,
processor.
you don't have to be in low latency. No, you could be in EDIT A, low latency off, and 120 will work with it.
Oh,
I'm just trying to think. Is there, you don't lose any bit depth? No.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I saw somebody asked here about what's the opinion as far as calibration. I did. I just literally got back last night from a tour in Texas, and I had to have done at least 5 Lumagen calibrations, and I think I did 2. It was either 2 or 3 NV calibrations. Um, I don't really see any difference. I mean, even the workflows. I use CalMan. Sammie uses Color Space.
Color space. I use
But
both.
in
I use both,
CalMan,
but
I mean, they're all they're literally identical processes in terms of what you do. The Mad VR, because it is a PC and it has a bigger slot thing. It has larger LUT sizes for interpolation, um, but again, it comes down to that thing that like I see the bigger numbers, but I'm not measuring anything that when I do one or the other that I'm seeing anything different. They both are more than capable of, especially with displays nowadays where they're actually fairly linear, right? Already, we're not.
mm,
I don't remember working on anything lately that I'm just like, this is, like how in the world did this display even get on the market? Where I would think that linearity is a big issue. So I haven't seen anything with either of them where, from a calibration standpoint, again, numbers be damned. I'm just talking about performance. where I'm really seeing any difference. Yeah, you're going to get you should, again, if the calibrator knows what they're doing, you're going to get a great result with either of them in terms of calibration itself.
I think that
Yeah.
comment too might have been oriented to the projectors before we started the.
Okay. I just saw that above that because somebody had said, sorry about that. I thought they were talking about the.
No, it's
Lumagen
still a
battery.
valid answer, but both ways.
Yeah, I would say that's true. You have a 33 point. So Lumagen is topped out at 21 points.
Yep.
NV can do 33 or 65. It has a much larger interpolated LUT, but it's interpolated because no software is going to be able to run that. Like, period. Like, it's not a thing. In terms of like process, like Kris says, they're literally like the same. Like you pretty much, if you know what you're doing, it's pretty much the same thing. And I will say this though, just because there's a lot of I don't want to say bad calibrators, but I guess I'll just say bad calibrators. So if the calibrator knows what they're doing, they're going to at least somewhat pre-cal the display first. Get the gamma as correct as possible. And after they do that, they are going to know what they should be targeting for their color space, right? And they're going to create a LUT for that color space. and then they're going to load that LUT. And then you should be reviewing content with them. If they leave your house and your picture's all red, do not let them leave or do not pay them. One of the two. So the process, though, is the same. If someone knows what they're doing, you're going to get good results out of a Lumagen or a NV. In terms of the JVC, the AutoCal software wasn't available at the time that we reviewed it, but it is going to be supported. I think there's going to be a few changes to it. In terms of calibration, they work exactly the same.
Yeah.
If you get one and someone's calibrating it, if they know what they're doing, again, they're not going to be going in there like going crazy, making changes to offsets in your bias. Like, that shouldn't be a thing, right? Because it's like, cool, you just turned my JVC into a Sony. You don't want that. I
think Sammie and I would both be in 100% agreement on when, we just had this big talk about MadVR versus Lumagen. I guarantee you, who you're having calibrate your projector will make a substantially larger difference in your video quality than those two video processors compared to each other.
It'll make a pretty big difference.
Many a time.
Yeah. It'll make a pretty big difference.
Yeah.
Let's jump on this question, Hi-Fi Home Theater. Any opinion on using HD Fury to force devices to send projectors player-led Dolby Vision? I think there's quite a few folks that do this now. And I think he's speaking from the perspective of having recently bought an Epson, the LS 12,000.
I don't do
LDV,
it, honestly.
The Dolby Vision, the hack. I look at it this way. At the end of the day, an HD Fury is a pretty cheap device. There are setup guides online that will walk you through it. They seem to change all the time because everybody has different opinions on how to do it, it seems like. If you have a projector that you're using for HDR and you're not satisfied with the way it looks, or you're like, I wouldn't mind seeing what something else looks like, but I don't want to spend, the money on a Lumagen or a MadVR processor, by all means try one out. It may or may not be better than what you have on Projector X or Y. But it was designed for flat panels. It was designed for flat panels that could follow PQ, but their HDR tone mapping, once they got away from PQ, was less than desirable, so they could use Dolby Vision's more advanced tone mapping for that. So now you have to set up a projector in PQ that didn't follow PQ already, which is why you didn't like the HDR, so that you can now overlay something onto their PQ that wasn't good already. So again, like subjectively, you might like it better than the other one. Is it, you're still running into, just baseline things that there's a lot of debate about this. It's cheap enough that if you want to try it, try it. It may improve some displays. You might not like it on others. I've never done an A/B comparison with a JVC running LLDV versus a JVC not running, running its own uh, tone mapping. Um, I just haven't seen the need to it. And again, like fundamentally, it doesn't really make any sense to me when I just break it down by what it's trying to do. But
Well,
some
especially
other
when
people
people
seem to really
start
like
putting
it.
that they're saying make it so that it's 10,000 nits. It's like, well, you wouldn't tone map at that point.
I,
Like, what are you
I
what are you
again,
doing?
I've seen a lot of people say a lot of stuff that I just take a step back and I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. But there's some people that feel pretty passionately about it and they really like it. And hey, if you like it and you like it better subjectively than what your other, what your projector's doing, regardless of who you are, hey, more power to you. I'm glad you found something you liked.
Yeah. I think it's cheap, and like you said, it's cheap enough that it's not going to hurt anything. And if at the very least, if it doesn't work out, you still have a pretty good switch that you can do, like, check things with the edits and stuff like that. And so it's cool. But if someone were to say have a JVC or an Epson, okay, and you're considering to do low latency Dolby Vision, you could just probably take that same money and buy a newer Apple TV or like a Roku that supports HDR10 Plus, because if it's Dolby Vision on there, it's going to come through as HDR10 Plus anyways, and you're still going to get the same benefit. And you don't have to do anything extra. So, like, I get it why people might want it, but to me, it's not something that I've really ever explored too much, because I just would go a different route personally.
So one of the other updates, right, on the NX800, NX or NZ, I always say NX. That's what I have. What I want to upgrade from, NZ800, NZ900. That genned up is the 8K eShift stuff. So there's a couple questions about that. Curious. So what do you guys think of those features? Is the new models any better in that regard? Do you use those features yourselves?
As I don't know if Sammie has any more information on this. As far as I know, it is called eShift X2, but I think that has more to do with the background video processing, like the sharpening and stuff like that. I'm not aware of anything that has to do with the actual shift itself. It's still a four-way shift. Um, it still will accept an 8K signal. It was already before a pixel throughput. So if you had an 8K signal coming in, there is no scaling going on. It's just mapping to the different points. So it's not trying to up convert it. It's literally saying, okay, these pixels would be here, these pixels would be there. Now, granted, those pixels are overlapped, so they're not, per pixel, but as far as I know, eShift X2 has more to do with the image processing from a sharpening standpoint, kind of like what he was saying. I know when I tested, they still have the standard high res 1, high res 2 on the NZ9s, the current NZ9 series. There's quite a bit of different. Even if you turn off all the all the sliders to 0, and you just pick standard high res 1 or high res 2, you will see a difference. Standard adds a little bit of sharpening in there. High res 1's a little more neutralish. High res 2 actually kind of softens the image, I would almost say, a little bit. On the new ones, when I did the same thing, I almost didn't. The high res 2 didn't really soften anything. I didn't really notice it do much more than high res 1. And high res and standard didn't seem like it was quite as edgy as it was before. But with any kind of image processing that has to do with detail enhancement or sharpness, I really feel that like it's a season to taste, because everybody's setup is a little different. Like, how good is their lens? How well is it focused? Are you using an anamorphic lens that might soften the image a little bit? So you're kind of trying to add that back. And some people just like what I would call a crispy image, and some people like a smoother, more natural image. So, again, it's just enhancements to the tools that they have there that you can kind of, again, season to taste the image the way you want.
Yeah, when I tested it, so one thing to note is that on their literature, they will say that it's like the display resolution of 8192 by 4320. That is not an acceptable input resolution. So you can only send it UHD 8K. So the actual, like, what is that? What is UHD 8K?
Oh, so does the new one actually allowing them to use the full 17:9 chip?
Well, that's what I'm
'Cause
wondering.
you couldn't do that before.
Yeah, I didn't test it. So the only
Oh,
thing
shoot.
that
Now
I
I'm
could,
mad I didn't test that.
well, yeah. So I thought about it after I sent it back, where it's like,
I'll actually
okay,
confirm with JVC Engineering on that, because that would be actually a significant feature for somebody using a lens.
right. Because
Because if
you
you were
could,
feeding in 4K 120 or 8K, now you would be able to use a lens and their anamorphic modes, where
right.
you couldn't before.
So what I tried to do was I had it. So I did a bunch of testing. I tested with different sources. I tested it with the NV and all that stuff, obviously. So with the NV, you can send it UHD 8K and you can send it DCI 8K. If you tried to send it DCI 8K, it wouldn't accept it. And that's because within the EDIT of the JVC, it does not support that DCI 8K resolution. So it will only actually accept like the
16:9.
7,000, the 16:9 version of it. But if you can do that and then turn on Zoom, then that would technically be the display resolution because you're using the 17:9 chip. So I need to test it when I get a hold of one again, or you could test it when you're here in like a few weeks.
Yeah.
But and I can bring
again,
my
like, to me, it's a feature that
radio.
doesn't really matter that much because there's no 8K content. I
Right.
know that like an NV can scale it to 8K and stuff like that, but I mean, we're past the point of pixel resolution, pixel density. At some point it just becomes numbers.
Oh yeah.
So,
Oh no, easily,
yeah.
easily. But like if someone could say send it, or even if they were on PC, right, and they were
gaming
playing
PC.
something,
For a PC desktop and stuff,
yeah,
gaming,
and then
even,
send it
possible.
the 7,000 resolution for UHD 8K, and then use Zoom to fill your screen, especially if you have a scope or if you have an actual 6 or 17:9 screen. That's useful.
Yeah.
But I didn't get a chance to test it.
Yeah.
Outside of that, I played Death Stranding with DLSS 2 or 3 or whatever's in the 4090. It looked fine. Like it was if you are gaming on it to get the absolute lowest latency, you actually do have to game at 8K, which is kind of crazy. Like you absolutely have to.
What's the why is that logistic?
Because it uses 240 hertz refresh rate when you're displaying 8K.
Oh, because it
uses 240 if you're using anything with the
eShift,
on.
right?
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, like I measured 24 milliseconds in 8K, but I measured, I think it was 30 milliseconds at 4K 120.
Oh, okay.
So if you absolutely want the lowest latency, then it would be in 8K 60.
The downside I see there is like the trade-off, at least maybe until the 5090 cards and stuff come out, is you need horsepower for frame rate and you need horsepower for resolution. So if you're having a gaming PC, kick up the resolution so high, right? Unless you're using DLSS or you're doing some other kind of resolution interpolation and upscaling. We don't have VRR. It's probably challenging to run a lot of latest AAA games in that way because we don't have the horsepower. I know a lot of folks were hoping for VRR in a next generation of projectors. Yeah.
Yeah, I would have liked to
Honestly,
at least seen them made it where they can sync faster. I mean, it's still pretty low for a projector. I measure about 3 to 5 seconds for a sync time, but
yeah,
like compared to my OLED that just syncs.
Yeah.
right.
I'd like to see that at some point. I did give JVC quite a bit of feedback after seeing the 900 and things I'd still like to see, going forward. There were a couple features that I was kind of hoping for from a next from this new generation that didn't make it. I'm sure that's the same case for everybody else. Every time they put out a new projector, I usually send them some feedback on things that I'd like to see, from, either firmware updates on this generation or something that they can add if it will require hardware for the next one.
Mm-hmm.
But it is what it is. Hopefully we
Yeah.
get some. Hopefully, again,
Yeah.
I'm just glad to see that they are still doing at least some R&D.
Were you going to
I mean,
comment
there's
more?
things that I would like to have seen, but as everyone, and obviously it's the same. Me and you are going to probably agree on most of the same stuff that we wanted to
Yeah.
see. But
Well, I had, even before I had known what this thing can do, and people were talking about, oh, it's probably going to be this year for JVC because it's been a few years. I also, tried to look at it realistically and say that, if you look at JVC compared to its primary competition, which honestly is just Sony, I mean, there really aren't a lot of projector manufacturers playing at this price range. Yeah, at the MP5 level, there's the Epson LS12000, and then there's, a few DLPs in there. And at the NZ9 level, there's like Barco, I think, has the Braggy that's kind of in that ballpark around there. But it is kind
yeah,
of this like price gap that Sony and JVC really kind of only play in. And Sony released that last line, and while it is a good projector, like I said, it did go backward in some things, and they clearly don't do a lot of things that the JVC does. And then that was when those came out, and then JVC made their firmware updates that took them a little bit farther in terms of some of the processing, even more away, farther from Sony. So I was looking at it going like, if I'm being realistic, JVC doesn't really have to do hardly anything because everybody else right now is kind of playing catch up.
Hmm.
Nobody has their contrast. Nobody else has a frame adaptive tone map. HDMI 2.1 is only in the Epson, but it's not 8K compatible where the JVCs are, and can do 4K 120. There's just a lot of things that it would take a pretty good jump from those. And again, that's not saying that these these are bad projectors by any chance, or throw good. I say it all the time. It's harder to find a bad projector now than it is a good one. It really just depends on what kind of quality you want.
right.
But they were in a position where they're far enough ahead in most key things that if they didn't do anything at all, they'd still be ahead. Um, where the other ones kind of have to play catch up. So, we haven't seen if Epson or Sony are going to release anything this year and what that's going to be. I would love to, I mean, I would love nothing more than to find out that like there's these huge breakthroughs in technology with LCD projectors and they're like right there in the thick of it. Or, they've made some huge step in DLP and now we're back to like, I would love to have more options than less, so
Right.
anything like I would love to see it, but I've been doing this a long time and I don't know if I become jaded or not, but I just feel like every year there's just the hype train of like, oh, I think this is going to be the year. I think this, I think that. And, maybe 15, 20 years ago, there were bigger jumps and stuff like that. But I've just got to the point now where I'm like, it's probably just going to be this, this, and this. And, it is what it is, but I mean, it's not like we're suffering here. All of these throw them, the content is so good. The projectors, are good enough that most people would be pretty happy with any of these, so.
Yeah, it's definitely not a bad projector. Like me and you talked about it, and I'm, I mean, we're fortunate enough that due to some of the stuff that we do, we have a lot of different displays come through our hands. So I've been able to test a lot of different displays in my own space just to see like, okay, I'm testing it for this, but would this work for me? And as many of the displays as I've been through, the different Sonys and Barcos, it kind of always just keeps coming back to JVC. Like it's really hard to beat price to performance. Even though they didn't give me everything that I wanted, it's still hard. It's still hard to beat. It's so hard to beat in terms
Yeah.
of its ability.
Yeah, Sammie was at the last comparison thing that I did for the screening room. In fact, he even came in a couple days before when I was sitting in there for literally all day for 3 or 4 days trying to set up all these projectors so that they could look their absolute best so people could look at them. And it is that thing, like I have set up so many different brands. And again, there are a lot of great looking projectors out there. You know, everybody has a little bit different needs. The JVC isn't perfect for everybody, but I have yet to look at something else, you know, especially in my space. I mean, I have a pretty big screen, but you know, there are people that need a lot more light than JVC can offer, and you know, obviously that kind of throws it out, you know, but they're just really hard to beat for a total package. I'm not, you know, that doesn't mean that they don't have things that they can prove upon, or they don't have their little quirks like everybody else has. But when you just start looking at everything that it does and the image that it puts up when it's properly set up, I honestly, again, as long as it can light up the screen, I would put it up against just about any projector at any price point, and you would be amazed at how well it would hold up and usually outperform in a lot of areas compared to anything. Honestly, anything out there. I don't care if it's a $5,000 projector or a $150,000 projector. It's amazing, if again, on a screen that it can properly light up, what it can do against anything else out there. I know that sounds like, you know, a lot, but I've done it quite a few times.
No, it's true. I mean, when we were at that event, it was funny. Like, you could put up the NZ8 and compared it to, I think it was the 7000, and you were playing the opening of Farmageddon with the space scene, and then you hit it, and the room's reaction to that stark of a difference, it was pretty funny. It was like,
yeah, I really wish people
like,
had the opportunity
gasp.
to go to those, because you know, we talk about these kind of things, and then there's the pundits and everything else, but it's like, you know, I've done a few of those. Anybody that would, I mean, if you sat down and watched how much work I put into making sure that that was literally as fair of a competition as humanly possible to do. And, you know, if you were in the room, you'd realize that, and I was actually criticized about it afterward, how I put in nothing into it. I never said anything to anybody. I said, hey, we're going to look at this scene. And it was just next, next, next. Not doing the thing that, like, hey, make sure you look at this or make sure you look at that. The only thing I said before we started was that I'm going to show you one, I'm going to show you the other, and then show you the other. I'm not going to show them simultaneously because nobody ever watches anything like that. I'm just going to show you one, and one. If you don't really notice a difference without me having to pause or point out, then there probably isn't enough difference that it matters. If there's a difference, you're going to see it. And Sammie was there the whole time, and it was really obvious when there was a difference because the room went from like crickets to, like, you know, fireworks. It would be like, oh my God, look at that. It was not subtle by any stretch of the imagination when there were differences. So anybody that's never been to one of those and they have the opportunity, especially if you know that, you know, whoever's running it is doing a really good job of making sure that it is a truly, you know, like not rigged, like some that I know that are out there. It is worth your time, especially if you're going to spend this kind of money. I mean, even if you had to fly out somewhere to see it, it would probably be worth your money to make a good decision, so you feel, you know, that you made the right choice. And you might be surprised that you're like, hey, you know, yeah, I went to that, and you know, I thought the JVC looked better, but God, I was really impressed with this other one that's going to cost me less. Like, I think a lot of people at that, you know, the Epson again was, you know, the lowest price projector there, and it looked great. Like, it looked great with almost everything on there. It struggled in the areas that you would think it would struggle, but you might have found that you like, yeah, I realize I'm giving up a little performance there, but God, it looked really good with everything else. So I'm going to save myself some cash, you know, and put it into something else. So
yeah, there's some options that are huge values for sure.
For sure.
Every time we've done a couple just local guys, not quite so super scientific, but we've shot off just the NX7 that I have against some Epsons and whatnot, and I've always left those experiences very happy owning the NX7. But with that in mind, I guess who would you say these models are for? I guess there's probably not a lot of NZ8 owners looking to directly map to the NZ800 and NZ9s, looking to spend the money to the NZ900s, I suppose, unless they're just deep pockets and ready to go. This certainly sweetens the deal for NX owners, but I guess what do you guys see as the upgrade path or the sweet spot of that?
I still think the sweet spot of any of the JVC line is always the middle one. The NZ8, NZ800. I mean, the big benefits of the 900 is obviously light output. I roughly basically put it that you can get NZ8 light levels, full out, like the highest output that the NZ8 is basically the mid laser of the NZ9. So you're just getting that much more. So, and the benefit of that is that if you need that much light and you can do it in mid laser, you're getting less noise from the projector, and you're also obviously not running it as high, so it's going to last longer, if that even matters with these kind of hours that they can do. Um, and then the NZ9 with the bigger lens just means that if you're somebody that is running a lot shorter throw, one, it can do a slightly shorter throw, but two, if you are doing a shorter throw, and especially with a bigger screen, to me, the real benefit of that lens over the other, because the other lens is pretty good, the all glass lens it's the fact that because you have more surface area, you're less likely to start getting into chromatic aberration and stuff. You will get into it faster with the NZ8 lens, especially if you're using a lot of lens shift or again a real short throw, because again that image going through the optics is going to be bigger in relation to the lens compared to the bigger lens of the 9. So again, that really comes into play at the the front half of the lens. But so light and that everything else about them is good. So if all you need is the light level of the NZ8 and it works for your throw or whatever, it's an incredible value.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The NZ8 and the 800, I mean, as crazy as it sounds, $15,000, $16,000 projectors, the sweet spot, but it really is just kind of like how if you're going to get a Sony, you might want to consider looking at a 6,000 versus a 7,000, and definitely over a 5,000.
Yeah.
As for who they're for,
people
I guess
have a room that looks like Sammie's behind you.
Yeah, technically anyone that wants one, right, can obviously get one. But
sure,
if you have an NZ8, in my personal opinion, going to an NZ800 does not make sense. Going to an NZ900 might make sense because it is an actual upgrade. Not that the 800 is not an upgrade from an 8. It's just more. It's like you're kind of sidestepping it, right? The same thing with the 9. If you have a NZ9 going to a 900, are there some benefits? Sure, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like you really need to figure out what you're getting from it. So a good example, say you use a video processor, Lumagen or an Envy, one of the two, doesn't matter. And you already have an NZ9. Okay, what you are going to technically get is going to be a little bit brighter. Black 4 might be a little bit lower. I think mine was like around 0.00, right? Yeah, 0.004 measured, which is pretty average. Who knows, you might get one with 0.003. But if you calibrate it, you can kind of get that anyways, right? So technically you might get a better Black 4. It will be a little bit brighter. It will be quieter, and it will be sharper.
You might get better uniformity as well.
Yeah, better uniformity.
We don't really know if that's going to be the average yet. Yeah.
Right. And then when you start looking at the things like frame adapt, you can't use that with a video processor. You can't use deep black with the video processor. The vivid picture mode. What the vivid picture mode does is if you're an SDR, it's slightly oversaturated and it uses a 7500 K color temperature. If you were to measure it in P3, it actually has less gamut coverage than natural, right? But if you're an SDR, it's fine. Someone might use it, but you wouldn't use it with a video processor. So you're not getting a whole lot. Now, if you're not using a video processor, it's like, okay, deep black might be something that you want. The new balanced laser dimming might be something that you want. Actually, that's pretty, I don't know if it's compelling enough to go from a 9 to a 900, but it is really good.
It almost
I would
sounds
just
like
say,
the iPhone ones where it's like, well, you can get a 14 or a 14S, and it's like, is it really worth like the? Yeah, there are these little things here, but it's not quite the generational step yet. So if you just
right.
need to have that one little thing, they do feel
Yeah.
like that a lot.
I say if it's an actual upgrade to what you have, then it's worth looking at. If you have an NZ7 and you want an 800, get an 800. If you have an 8 and you want a 900, get a 900. But going from 8 to 800, 9 to 900, to me personally, doesn't make a lot of sense.
I do want to bring up the 7, the NZ7.
Mm.
The 8 and the 9, they're bigger benefits. If you think of the 8 and the 9 versus the 7, the benefits that come to my head immediately is the color filter. If you wanted to do full P3, the high contrast optical block, and the fact that they have dual apertures. Okay, those last two make a big difference in the contrast that you're looking at. And then the first one is just whether or not you're going to get P3. But the interesting thing there is that the NZ7 doesn't have a P3 filter, but its raw color space coverage is higher than the 8 and the 9 when they don't have the color filter in place. And it's honestly high enough that if my NZ9 had the same gamut coverage of most of the NZ7s that I measure, I wouldn't use the color filter. It's the fact that it doesn't have that much that I have to use the color filter. So I would say the color's a wash. I would say that, the color filter doesn't matter because your gamut coverage is close enough with the 7 that you don't really need it. Okay, so then we get to the contrast thing. Well, the contrast thing sounds great on paper. It's like, oh, I get to increase my contrast. But again, like, I calibrate these all the time. I have done literally hundreds of JVC calibrations. I've done probably in the last month alone, I've probably done 20 plus easily, if not 30, 40 of them. So I would say that the vast majority of my clients are rarely using an aperture because of the fact that most people are using bigger screens and they need all the light they can get. So it's actually pretty rare for me to go to a client's house and I'm closing the aperture down. I would love to because it would give them more contrast, but it just doesn't happen a lot. So having a dual aperture doesn't matter if you can't really use it. And again, most people are putting these on screens that I honestly feel a lot of times are too big for the projector that they have,
Yeah.
and they end up needing all the light. And then the light engine for the mixed contrast doesn't really matter unless you have a room that's like a black pit, because almost mixed contrast, I mean, yes, you can make a projector with better mixed contrast than the JVCs. A lot of DLPs have them and things, but once again, I find that 99% of rooms probably that I go in, they're the limiting factor in mixed contrast, not the projector, because of the wall colors or whatever and the light scatter in the room. It wouldn't matter if you had 1,000 to 1 ANSI and like literally a straight line from on off to ANSI, because their room is bombarding that screen with light and it doesn't matter anyway. So in my room, that's basically a velvet line pit, yes, there's a lot of benefit there is a benefit to having a higher mixed contrast that maybe the 8 and 9 did if you did some direct comparisons. But even then, like, it would be an interesting comparison with mixed content to see how much of that was really that visible. But it certainly isn't in most rooms that I go in. So
Yeah, I've got the bat cave, but I definitely am throwing.
But there's definitions of bat cave. Some people say they have a bat cave because they have like, oh, I have dark gray walls or even black walls with flat paint. But even that is going to scatter light more than something that, like, your walls are lined.
Velvet,
Like,
yeah.
it
Right.
takes a lot to control light in a room, and you honestly pretty much have to line it to do it. Like, paint helps. It's definitely, I'd rather go into a room with dark gray and black paint than white paint, but you're still getting a lot of light scatter when you're on walls like that, more than most people think. So.
Assuming if we assume some reasonably dark room, is there any baseline of screen size relative to projector choice, or is it just too many variables to put too much of
Variables
a
to the
generalization?
gain and things, gains
Yeah.
and throw and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So
Like one thing people, so I come across the same thing. Like people will have, and I get it. Like they, especially as people when it's their first projector, usually they want this huge, massive screen. And it's like, okay, cool, you got a huge, massive screen, but what you got is not sufficient to light it. And then you have it like 16 feet back. Like this is not going to work. It's like, well, how do I fix it? Well, you either get a better projector or you get a smaller screen and then you move the projector forward. Like most people go too big their first time.
Hmm.
And then another thing that a lot of people don't realize is when you're looking at these contrast numbers, you're never going to watch the projector in the state that it's needed to get 150,000 to 1 contrast.
Right.
Like that, for me to even measure that, I had to be in high bright, aperture -15, 23 feet and like 6 inches away from the screen in order to get 150,000 to 1 contrast
I
ratio
think if you have
measurement.
a JVC, you're pretty much going to, again, 99.9% of end users, you're going to end up somewhere in the mid to upper 20s and maybe into the 30s at best. It's very rare that I see somebody that can use the aperture to get higher than that from a native standpoint. You know, laser dimming changes things a bit.
Yeah.
But from a native standpoint of what you're actually going to get, you're going to be 25 to 30,000, probably somewhere in that ballpark, with some getting that super sample or whatever, or they're using a longer throw where they're getting into the 30s. But you're going to be in that range, and again, that's still dramatically better than you're going to get with anybody else. But
By far.
that is a more realistic range in terms of like what kind of contrast you're actually going to get.
Yeah.
Hockey player, yes, I want one. I'd love it if you can help me out with that.
Yeah, I think I might be in for that too.
Thank you very much. Let me
I was
know.
hoping we'd see that on Kaleidoscape, but who knows?
I don't know who's handling that release, and I think there's something about like it can't be released in the same year as the other one. That was an agreement Toho made with Legendary, so that's gonna hold that up. So I don't know, but yeah, I'd like to have that.
Yeah. Yeah, I never went. Did you guys go to the show? See, we're talking about Godzilla -1.
I saw it in the theater and
you?
enjoyed it, but
I didn't see it. I was waiting for it to come home, and I wish I had saw it in the theater. But
you know what's going to
oh well.
happen, Jeremy? It's going to come out on Kaleidoscape, but it's not going to have like the black and white and the color version. The disc has both. You know, there seems to be those little quips lately. Like we can almost do another Kaleidoscape, you know, thing with like these little things like that, where like, why am I getting this and not that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's definitely time to update the Kaleidoscape content. Looking back, it seems crazy, but it's like been almost a couple years now since doing a lot of that conversation earlier in the channel.
I have a completely different Kaleidoscape system than I did then too.
Yeah.
So
yeah, still hard to beat, but we'll see. Talking to companies that we want to see hot new models.
Yeah. Anything else?
Yep, I was just gonna ask the same question. Any other thoughts? If anybody has other questions on these projectors, we can take them. Those will probably.
I'm glad that we saw an incremental update. You know, again, that's better than not getting an update. I'm like everybody else. There were definitely some things that I was hoping to see that I didn't see, but I certainly it's still got a nice little gap between it and its competition that, you know, and it just got a little bit bigger, you know, not as maybe as big as some people were kind of hoping for, but it's still a great projector. So
My only thing is still, and I know this is probably the biggest problem for most people, is even if you're going to use a filter, there has to be a way to reduce it from 33% to something else. Because like you could take a Barco, for instance. If you put the cinema filter on in a Barco, you're only losing 15 to 18% of your luminance, right? you can put it on in other projectors and maybe lose,
But I think that's because on the barcodes, it's a single chip, correct? So it has to do with the interaction of that with the color wheel. It's just like if you look at the RS 4500, it took like what? It was like 45% of the light
40
output.
something.
So they already got it better than that one was. If you looked at the Sony 5000 ES, the old big model,
Right.
50%, you know what I mean? So there's
Yeah.
something about the polarizers that they use and then whatever the filters that they're using to create the light outside of that, that it takes a bigger toll than we think it is because of how they have to do their light for these chips. Where DLP, that's the thing about DLP, it's like it's such a different technology than
That's
LCOS
true.
that you know, it's like all these people that go like, why can I buy a 3000 lumen DLP for $1,000 when it, you know, a 3000 lumen Sony or JVC? Well, I'm like, well, JVC has a $3,000, a 3000 lumen DLP model, you know, that little one that's like, I don't know, 4 grand. But
Yeah.
DLP is literally just a mirror that you're reflecting off of. It doesn't do anything to that light. Where LCOS, any light going through it, without it doing anything,
You're going
is
to be
already,
losing light.
you've lost 50%
Right.
of the light going through there. So the light engine has to be able to put out more than double what the light engine for the same amount of light as a DLP does. So if you're doubling that
Yeah.
output, then you have heat, then you have all those other things like that. So again, it's like it's people do that all the time, but it's not an apples to apples. I mean, I would love that it was, but
Right.
it's
Yeah.
just not. You know, it's a
I just wish it
completely
was like
different type of
a little
light
bit
engine.
less.
Yeah.
Like even if it were like bring me into the 20s or make it so that your native gamut coverage was 91, 92.
No, I
Like
get it.
just, yeah, that's the one thing that I really wanted that I didn't get. Like anything else in terms of whether it been dual lasers or hybrid, light engines, didn't really need. It's just those were really the only two things that I wanted. And it's like,
Yeah,
but
the dual laser thing would have been nice, but I also wonder, you know, laser dimming is a really popular feature right now with the JVCs. Like a lot of people like it. If you went to a blue red laser combination, you know, you're operating at a different wavelength for each of those lasers, and you know they are a different laser. You know, each one is a different diode that might work on a different cycle rate. So how they might have looked at it and said, yeah, we might. Again, this is total speculation. I have zero here, but I'm like, maybe that wouldn't work with laser dimming. You know, like, okay, yeah, we could do that, but we can't dim those. It's like some of the
right.
Christies are like that, where there was a bunch of talk about like, oh, the Christies are going to get laser dimming and these are going to be great, but they can't do it because the three laser, you know, especially in the high end models, trying to modulate three completely different laser diodes that are working in different operating cycles, you start
Especially for
getting all kinds
red,
of problems
because you
with
have to
that.
try to reduce the speckle, right?
Exactly. So I don't know, you know, that might be something. It might just be a cost thing. It might be a heat. I have no idea. That was the feature I wanted. I've said for a long time now that because HDR is the norm now, pretty much with most content, streaming or otherwise, that P3 should be like 709. Like we shouldn't have to be using filters to get P3 at this point. P3 should be the minimum color gamut that you get with no help. If you're going to put a color filter, it's because I'm getting, you know, now 90 or 95% of 2020 if I want to get it. But P3 should be, you should be at like basically 98% or more of P3 with no help at all. And that should be the baseline.
Yeah. But I will say that even with everything that I wanted that I didn't get, it's still good enough
Yeah.
that I'm going to get one. I'm still going to end up buying one. So,
It's still, yeah, it, like I said, it's still hard to beat.
yes.
I think it's just that thing where you've got something that is so good that you're just like, God, just that little bit more, and it would literally be almost perfect.
Right.
You
Exactly.
know, and
Yeah.
that's the thing. You know, you're always just like, oh, that's so close. But I mean, isn't that everything? You know, when it
Yeah. Oh,
comes to
easily.
consumer electronics or just about everything, you know?
Yeah. Yep.
Oh,
Yep.
if only it was just that one thing.
Yep.
We can hit Michael's question here. Any take on the larger size of flat panels and competing against projectors? Or what do you guys see in that regard with clients? Still a lot of projectors, diminishing projectors for larger and larger flat panels?
I see more projectors.
Yeah, I was going to say, my client base is probably, I mean, I know that other calibrators are different, but I would say that the amount of clients I have, that are basing their system on a flat panel is tiny. Now, that doesn't mean that the market segment is tiny or anything, but in terms of home theaters and stuff. But again, like, how many of them are getting calibrated and stuff? It's not really a good reference. This one's a really hard one. Again, like most people that are into home theater that I'm around, and again, I only can go on what I'm around, are getting bigger screens, not smaller. Like if you asked me 10 years ago, like what the average screen was out there, I would say 120 to 130 inch diagonal 16 by 9 screen. That was literally what I saw more often than not. Nowadays, that's probably maybe less than 25%. If anything, I'm just seeing bigger and bigger screens being put in.
Mm.
I'm seeing, like 140 to 150 diagonal now being like the norm, more and more and more. So, will flat panels cut into that market? I don't know. I've heard the promise of like bigger and bigger flat panels over the years. I mean, God, it feels like 10 years ago, there was like, oh, there's going to be rollable OLEDs in the next 5 years. Just wait,
Yeah.
you just be able to order whatever size you want, roll it right out. And, I
Sure.
was like, I'd love to see that. But, we're still here. And, anything over 77 inches costs, $20,000 plus. And I keep hearing about like people saying like, oh, here in the next few years, we're going to start seeing 100-inch, 110-inch, 120-inch TVs, and they're going to be cheap. And I'm like, I personally, I just, again, stepping back and thinking about it, that makes zero sense to me because of the logistics of it all. It's like one, the market of people that can put 120-inch piece of glass in a room feels tiny to me. The amount of like shipping that,
Mm.
um, I mean, just the logistics of the company getting it to the dealer having to stock it, the logistics of getting it from a store to a client, from the store into the client's home, having the wall space, all these other things. So now your volume compared to, let's even say, a 77 inch, I mean, you've got to be at like such a tiny percentage of people that are cross shopping that, you know, it's not something you're going, you can go into Costco right now and there's plenty of 77-inch, 80-inch TVs. I just don't see a day where we're like, I'm going into Costco and like, wow, look at, there's 115-inch options here and
Yeah.
things like that, because you need volume to get price down. That's just it. I don't see it. Would I love to be wrong? Sure. I want people to have a big screen that looks fantastic. I don't care what technology it is, but yeah, to
Well,
call
plus
me
the resale
skeptical.
value, just reselling it is difficult.
Yeah.
It's so
Yep.
easy to resell a projector. It
Yeah.
might be a little harder to resell a screen, but I have a hard enough time reselling just straight 77-inch TVs. They're not necessarily cheap either, but they're still difficult to resell them. So I just don't see them being viable. Most people want something bigger. No one that I know or do calibrations for, generally they're all projection. If they are using like a flat panel, it's a
It's in a family
77-inch and
room.
maybe it's like a media room or something like that. It's not like a quote unquote theater.
I've never had a client to date that has a flat panel in a theater room unless it's behind a screen.
Mm.
Like where they have it where it pops up and they turn on all their lights and then they have a TV behind it for the news. I've never seen an actual home theater with a flat panel in it.
Yeah, I don't think there's any
I've seen
substitute.
micro LED, but I mean that's still like insanely expensive. But just the TV market in general.
Yeah, size is
But again,
immersion, and
I'd love
wider
for it
than.
to happen. I personally just I think that we're getting close to the size limits that again for affordable mass market TVs. there's always going to be the one-offs like, oh, TCL has some model that you can get that you could special order and stuff, but it's
Right. And they're generally
Well,
sure,
lower
if you
spec in
like
the
that,
lines
great,
too.
but
Yeah.
That's what I have. Is I have this TV in here. So 77 S95C maybe has 60 hours on it. Don't really use it for testing, but the main reason it's there is for if I need to check something real quick. Every other time is like the screen comes down. Like that's what I have.
yeah. I have a 77-inch OLED. It's a great TV, looks great and everything else, but it's not the same. But again,
Yeah.
for some people, they can only have a screen so big. So,
Mhm.
I mean, if all you can put in your room is a 90-inch TV or a 100-inch TV, by all means, like, it's going to give you a fantastic picture if you can get a flat panel like that. I'm not disputing
Yep.
that by any stretch. Today's OLEDs and all this stuff, that they're amazing technologies and they throw an amazing image, but them, like taking over the home theater market, I think they're taking over, like obviously people are benefiting from them in family rooms and stuff like that, but
Yeah.
the rooms I'm going in, like people would laugh at you if you said, hey, you're going to replace this with a 100-inch or 110-inch TV. It's still kind of postage stampy.
Yeah.
All right. One last super chat. So let's take it. I don't know if you guys can comment on this since you might have some insider knowledge as well. But thanks, Bobby Digital, for the super chat. Or any truth maybe, or let's say thoughts on Barco and Christie kind of coming down to challenge in the
I
Sony
haven't
JVC
heard of
space.
anything. Barco has the Braggy. I think that's down around like NZ9 pricing.
It's a little bit more, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bit
Yeah.
more, but I mean, it's the closest that I can think of.
Yeah, that's the
And
closest.
Barco
Yeah.
seems to be kind of going more toward the micro LED because Barco's always been kind of large screen, like a lot of light output. So at the shows they've been showing that, but I haven't heard anything about Barco putting anything that's like below the Braggy, and I certainly haven't heard anything about Christie. Again, I would love to see them both come into this market because I like competition and I like variety. I'd love to have more options to look at, but I haven't heard anything about it.
Yeah, Barco. So you have the Broggy and the Broggy CS. I think the cheapest, and I definitely correct me if I'm wrong. I want to say the cheapest is maybe around 34,000, and I'm not even sure if that has a lens with it.
It's in
And
the
then
30s. I know that.
yeah, and then the Christie. I mean, they have the 4K 15, but to make that suitable for like home theater use, you would probably have to get like a modified high contrast lens, which is putting you up towards what 60,000.
Yeah.
They do have what do they have now? It's like the 4K 10.
I know the 4K 15 and stuff. I don't remember. I don't really pay that much attention to. I've only worked on one of those. No, two of them so far. But I haven't looked at like the different levels that they do with those. They're still pretty big projectors. They're like GTZ 380 or bigger size, aren't they?
4K 15 is the size of a NZ9, maybe a little bit
Oh, is it?
bigger.
Okay.
Yeah. They have one that's a little bit smaller. So they have the 4K 10, I think, and then there's something else that's like something 860 or something like that. That's kind of small, but I'm not sure what price point that plays in.
Okay, yeah, 4K 10, yeah.
Yeah.
11,000 lumens is pretty good, but it is a one chip. It's not going to be native 4K. Not that it matters. I mean, the DLPs do a pretty good job with shifting that it don't really matter, but it is not native 4K. But I bet you this probably gets pretty good color gamut coverage, but it would probably be pretty low contrast overall. I mean, it would have good mixed contrast like all DLPs do. Yeah, so it's a 0.66 DMD, so the contrast range on that, I mean, they're saying their dynamic contrast is only 5,000.
Ooh.
Real black, they're saying 2 million to 1. Oh, so right there, 1,100 to 1 full on off. So, I mean, that's like a quarter of what an Epson puts out. But again, their mixed contrast is going to look good. So, again, these projectors have their place. And depending on the kind of content you watch, and stuff, or how big the screen is, 10,000 ANSI lumens, you can put a pretty big screen in there. you can fill up screens that JVCs definitely aren't going to be filling up and stuff. So
Yeah.
again, these all have like a place. They're like a truck. Do you need the small pickup truck? Do you need the 1 ton? Do you need the 2 ton? You know,
Mhm.
sometimes, it's just the tool for the job.
Yeah, it really just depends on what you want.
I haven't heard anything about a UST. JVC did ask me about UST, I think like 2 or 3 years ago, what I thought about it. At the time, it was still kind of a blooming market. I haven't been impressed with any of the ultra short throw stuff that I've looked at from a performance standpoint. Again, from people need them for applications and are happy with them, and that's great. I personally haven't been really that impressed with them from a performance standpoint, but I haven't heard anything about them working on or releasing a UST.
The 4 movie was excuse me, the 4 movie was pretty good. I would say in terms of contrast, it was probably one of the more impressive USTs I've seen. I'm not a huge fan of USTs though. Um, they're too particular. I really don't like them. Um, not that some of them don't throw great pictures, because they do, but that's one of the cases where it's like, okay, if you're going to go with a UST, just get a 100-inch TV and call it a day.
Projection's interesting. I've brought this up before with other people. I look at projection systems, whether it's even ultra short throw would apply to this. If you don't have a projection system and all you've ever had is a 55, 65, maybe even a 77-inch TV, and then you go to a projection system, I feel like when you get into projection the first time, it honestly doesn't matter what you get, because you're going to be so enamored with the fact that you have an image that big. So that first time that you turn that on and you're like, that is in my room and I get to see an image that
Right.
big. I
Yeah.
think it's like that. You can call it the honeymoon period or whatever, but like some people, like the quality of the image is a distant fifth place to the fact that they have that image size in a room. And ultra short throw might be the way to get that. Maybe it's a gateway drug to better projection systems down the line and stuff like that. Um, I feel like even if, even big flat panels, like let's say you go from 55 and then, there's a good sale and you move up to 77, but then you're at the store, you go to your buddy's house and there's 98 and you're like, oh man, look at that. But eventually, like 98, it's like anything else. Eventually you're going to get used to it and be like, wow, it's really not as big as I remember it being. Like, you know, because like I
Yep.
went from a 65 to a 77 and I felt like it didn't even do anything. I was like, is it really bigger, and stuff like that. But then I think back to when I got into this hobby, 99% of people, projection was like insanely expensive compared to what it is now. So most people had rear projection TVs. And I mean, at that time, a 65-inch rear projection TV was huge, and was like kind of the top of the market. Um, and now a 65-inch flat panel that has the same image area like looks tiny to me. So, again, like I'm all for anything that makes people start looking at home theater and going bigger, because once you've experienced it, it's really hard to go backward
It is.
when it comes to size and and
Yeah.
stuff like that. And again, even though like my projector is not an OLED or anything like that, I would be very surprised for anybody to come over and pick anything that they want to watch in my room and be like, yeah, I mean, I guess this looks good, but I'm so used to my OLED that I don't think I could handle this, because it just wouldn't happen. I've had so many people over, including some big names in this industry that only look at OLEDs, come into my system and been like, this just looks like my OLED, but a lot bigger.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
like once you've seen what can be achieved, even though the numbers don't stack up, it can be pretty eye opening.
Yeah. I've had the same thing. People will come over and they're like, I didn't know that this is what projection look like. It's like, yeah, this is what it can look like. And there's like, oh, wow.
I mean, another thing is that a good, and this is something that I think we should have probably covered this earlier. Having a good projector and a good screen does not mean you're going to have a good projection system. I have been in so many rooms that have the same projector as me and the same screen, and the image that they're watching day in and day out could not be farther away from the image I watch with the same equipment day in and day out. You know, whether that's calibration, but a lot of it has to do with the room itself. If you're using a JVC in a room that looks like this that I'm in, like, and believe me, like, this is pretty common, where I walk in and I'm just like, you could have bought anything. Yes, the full black is still better because the room doesn't control black, but like everything else you're watching is just washed out. So like you might as well have bought something else. You know, so if you have my screen and my projector in this room I'm in now, you're not seeing what that the potential of that is. You take any of those people and then, you know, bring them in a bus over to my house and they're going to be like, oh, I didn't even know you could do that. Yeah. So
talking about the drop in sizes, I remember.
And that's what I was talking about earlier, where I'm like, you know, yeah, you can spend money on X and Y, like, oh, but maybe if I add this video processor, it'll make it all better. It ain't going to make this better. But if you spent the money that you spent on buying X or Y and instead put it into making your room, you know, better for it and things like that, you know, money way better spent in terms of, again, like changing that dynamic.
2013 in our living room, we went from an 80-inch 1080p to a 4K 75, I think it was at the time, in the Vizio line. And my daughter, she was 4 years old at the time. She was so distraught. She's the next one in the household that's like the audio video fan. Those 5 inches, like she was distraught about that for quite a while. That size reduction. She was very happy when we went back up to 85 a couple of years later with the the bigger Sony.
Well, hey, I've really enjoyed this, but I'm a single parent tonight, and clock's out that time where I got to go tuck in the little ones. So, hey, I really appreciate the opportunity, Jeremy. I always like coming on here. Thank you to everybody that chimed in. Love seeing you again, Sammie. I'll see you in Colorado here in about a week or so.
Yep, sounds good.
You know, if anybody wants anything else from me, any kind of questions or anything, feel free to email me, deepdiveav@gmail.com. I have some tours coming up in the DC area, Colorado. I'll be hitting Florida towards the end of the year, probably be in California again, maybe by the end of the year. Definitely NorCal, maybe SoCal, Tennessee, Kentucky area, possibly the latter part of this year. But, you know, reach out if you need services. I'll put you down on a list if I'm going to come in the area. But yeah, like I said, appreciate the time. Hope everybody has a great night.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kris. Awesome.
See you, Kris.
Yeah, one of you guys needs to hit Detroit after my NZ900 goes in.
I'll probably be in Minnesota sometime soon, and it could probably swing through that way.
Cool. You want to plug up your stuff, Sammie, and we'll call it a night here. We're about 2 hours.
Sure. So you can reach me at sdprescott, Prescott, jr@gmail.com for any type of calibration or consulting services. You can also read my reviews on Projector Central. I have them for some of the JVCs, the NV Extreme Mark II. If you have any questions, just reach out. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks everybody for tuning out tonight. Hopefully this conversation stands as incredibly useful for anybody that's considering picking up one of these projectors. These conversations are exactly the conversations that we've been having all week, basically.
Yeah.
So in the debate of what to get and all that. So
yeah,
hopefully this was helpful.
So yeah, hopefully people found it helpful. So
awesome. All right, we'll be back for another live podcast soon enough. Thanks everybody for turning out. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone.